On the evening of July 1st, 2000, Sarah was playing near a cornfield close to her grandfather's home in Kingston Gorse, West Sussex. She had been with her 13 and 11-year-old brothers and 5-year-old younger sister. As soon as her oldest brother realized his sister was missing, he raced back to his grandfather's house for help. The police were quickly alerted and a search was launched. The news soon spread across the country and made national headlines. Alongside searches of the area, officers began to question local sex offenders the day after Sarah had disappeared. One person was arrested during this time, but they would later be released. Officers and volunteers left no stone unturned, while Sarah's parents made daily appeals on news stations in the hopes of helpful leads coming in. On July 10th, an announcement was made by police regarding information of a possible sighting of Sarah on the M6 motorway in Cheshire on July 2nd. It's unclear whether this was actually Sarah. The search for young Sarah would come to a tragic end on July 17th. A body was located in a field in West Sussex, approximately 15 miles or 24 kilometers from where Sarah had disappeared.
On a warm summer evening in July 2000 in the quiet countryside of West Sussex, nothing seemed out of place. Children were playing. Families were unwinding. The air carried that familiar sense of safety that small communities often take for granted. It was the kind of evening where danger feels impossible until it is. 9-year-old Sarah Evelyn Isabel Payne was exactly where she was supposed to be, out with her siblings, laughing, playing, living in the innocence of childhood. There were no warning signs, no raised alarms, just a fleeting moment, the kind that passes unnoticed every single day. And then she was gone. At first it didn't feel real. A child doesn't just vanish into thin air. Not here, not in a place like this. But as minutes turned into hours and hours stretched into a growing, unbearable silence, panic began to take hold. Families searched. Voices called out her name into the fading light. The ground beneath their feet felt suddenly unfamiliar, unsafe. By nightfall, fear had settled over the community like a storm cloud. What followed would grip an entire nation. Police launched an urgent search, racing against time in a case where every second mattered. Helicopters circled overhead. Officers combed fields, roads, and hedgerows. Volunteers flooded the area, determined to bring Sarah home. But with each passing day, hope began to battle something darker, something far more chilling. Because this wasn't just a disappearance. It was something far worse. As the investigation deepened, the case began to reveal unsettling truths. This was not a random vanishing. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone had taken her, and that meant someone out there knew exactly what had happened. The media storm erupted almost instantly. Headlines dominated the country. Parents across the United Kingdom held their children closer. Fear spread beyond West Sussex, reaching into homes, schools, and streets nationwide. This wasn't just one family's nightmare anymore. It had become a national crisis. And then came the discovery that would change everything. A breakthrough, devastating and irreversible. What investigators uncovered would not only confirm the worst fears, but also ignite one of the most intense manhunts the country had ever seen. The case would go on to expose the dark reality of predators hiding in plain sight, and it would challenge the very systems meant to protect the most vulnerable. But perhaps most haunting of all was the question that lingered in the minds of millions. Could this have been prevented? Because somewhere, hidden in the shadows of this case, were missed warnings, overlooked signs, and a truth that would leave a permanent mark on the nation. And as the investigation closed in, one name would emerge from the darkness. A man whose past held secrets that should never have been ignored. Roy Whiting. This is the story of what really happened to Sarah Payne. A story of innocence stolen, a community shattered, and a case that would change the United Kingdom forever. The name didn't come immediately. For days, the investigation moved in widening circles, fields, roads, nearby villages, every inch of West Sussex combed with a growing sense of dread. Officers worked around the clock, retracing steps, interviewing anyone who might have seen something, anything. But in cases like this, the most dangerous enemy is time, and time was slipping away. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah Evelyn Isabel Payne was painfully ordinary. She had been playing in a field near her grandparents' home in the small village of Kingston Gorse. It was a place that felt safe, familiar, a place where children could run freely without fear. That sense of security would soon be shattered. Witnesses described a quiet summer evening, nothing unusual, no screams, no obvious struggle, just a moment where Sarah drifted slightly away from the others and vanished. It was that silence that terrified investigators the most. Because abductions that happen without noise, without witnesses stepping forward immediately, often suggest something far more sinister, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Within hours, Sussex police escalated the case. What began as a missing person report quickly turned into a suspected abduction. Officers sealed off key areas. Search teams were deployed in waves, sweeping through fields and hedgerows with methodical precision. Helicopters hovered low, their searchlights cutting through the dark like blades. But there was nothing. No trace. No clue. Just absence. As dawn broke the following day, the scale of the search intensified. Hundreds of volunteers joined the effort, neighbors, strangers, parents who couldn't bear the thought of a child disappearing without a trace. The countryside transformed into a massive grid of human movement, each person hopping to be the one who found something, anything that could lead Sarah home. But hope was beginning to shift. What had started as a desperate search for a missing girl was slowly becoming something else. Something heavier. Something darker. Inside the investigation, officers began focusing on the possibility that Sarah had been taken by a stranger. It was a chilling line of inquiry, but one they couldn't ignore. Cases involving children taken in open spaces often point to opportunistic predators, individuals who watch, wait, and strike when the moment presents itself. And that meant one thing. The person responsible could have been watching long before anyone realized. Detectives began knocking on doors, building timelines, gathering fragments of information from anyone who had been in the area that evening. Every car seen, every unfamiliar face, every small detail was cataloged, cross-referenced, and scrutinized. Then came the first break. A witness came forward with a detail that would change the direction of the case, a sighting of a man acting suspiciously near the area where Sarah had been playing. It wasn't much, just a fleeting observation, but in an investigation like this, even the smallest thread can unravel something much larger. The description was vague, but it was enough to spark urgency. Police began constructing a profile, someone local or familiar with the area, someone confident enough to approach without causing alarm, someone who blended in. And perhaps most disturbingly, someone who had done something like this before. As days passed, the case began to grip the entire nation. Media coverage intensified. Sarah's face appeared everywhere, on television, in newspapers, across posters and public appeals. Her smile became a symbol of innocence, and her disappearance a source of collective fear. Parents across the UK began to rethink what safe really meant. Children were no longer allowed to wander freely. Doors were locked earlier, eyes stayed sharper. Because if something like this could happen in a quiet village like Kingston Gorse, it could happen anywhere. Behind the scenes, investigators were beginning to connect dots. They started looking beyond the immediate area, digging into records of known offenders, particularly those with histories of crimes against children. This wasn't routine anymore. This was targeted, focused, urgent. And then a name surfaced. Roy Whiting. At the time, he was just one of many individuals flagged during background checks. A man with a troubling past. A man who had previously been convicted of abducting and sexually assaulting a young girl years earlier. That detail alone sent a ripple through the investigation team, because it raised a terrifying possibility. If someone like that was free, if someone like that had been in the area, then this wasn't just a random act. It was history repeating itself. But at that moment, there was no direct evidence linking him to Sarah's disappearance. Just suspicion, just a name among many. Investigators couldn't act on instinct alone. They needed proof. And proof was painfully hard to come by. Meanwhile, the search continued. Days turned into a week. And then on July 17th, 2000, over 2 weeks after Sarah vanished, the investigation reached a devastating turning point. A body was discovered in a remote area near Pulborough. The location was secluded, overgrown, hidden from plain sight. It was the kind of place you wouldn't stumble upon unless you were looking for something or hiding something. Officers arrived at the scene with a sinking sense of inevitability. Deep down, many of them already knew. When the confirmation came, it hit like a shockwave. It was Sarah. The search was over. But the case was far from finished. What investigators now faced was no longer a missing persons inquiry. It was a murder investigation. And with that shift came a new urgency, a new intensity, and a new determination to find the person responsible. The discovery of Sarah's body changed everything. Forensic teams descended on the scene, meticulously collecting evidence. Every fiber, every footprint, every trace mattered. Because in cases like this, physical evidence often speaks louder than witnesses ever can. And this case would soon prove just how powerful forensic science could be. Back at the incident room, the focus narrowed. The list of potential suspects shrank as investigators began aligning evidence with timelines, movements, and behaviors. Patterns started to emerge, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once seen. And once again, that name resurfaced. Roy Whiting. This time, it wasn't just a background check. It was something more. Something concrete. Something that couldn't be dismissed. Detectives began digging deeper into his movements, his history, his connections to the area, and what they found painted a picture that was as disturbing as it was compelling. A man with a past that should have raised alarms. A man who had slipped through the cracks. A man who had been free when perhaps he never should have been. As the investigation tightened around him, the pressure mounted. Surveillance increased. Interviews became more focused. Every action, every inconsistency, every detail was examined under a microscope. Because now, the question wasn't just what happened to Sarah. It was, who did this and how close are we to proving it? The answer was coming. Slowly. Relentlessly. And when it did, it would expose not only a killer, but a system that had failed to stop him. The case of Sarah Payne was no longer just about justice. It was about accountability. And in the shadows of this investigation, the truth was beginning to surface, piece by piece, leading detectives closer to a man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The closer investigators moved toward the truth, the more unsettling the case became. Because this wasn't just about a single moment in July 2000. It was about everything that came before it. Inside the investigation room, walls were now covered with timelines, maps, and photographs. Every known movement, every possible connection laid out in a desperate attempt to reconstruct the final hours of Sarah Evelyn Isabel Payne's life. Detectives worked in silence more often now, the weight of what they were uncovering pressing heavily on every decision. The focus had narrowed. And once again, all roads seemed to circle back to one man. Roy Whiting. This time, Investigators weren't looking at him as just another name on a list. They were looking at him as a potential answer. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. In a case this high profile, with the entire country watching, they needed something undeniable, evidence that could stand in court, evidence that could not be explained away. And so they turned to science. Forensic teams began analyzing every piece of material recovered from the scene where Sarah's body had been found. Fibers, soil, biological traces. Each fragment was processed with extreme precision, using techniques that, at the time, were becoming increasingly sophisticated. It was meticulous work. Slow, painstaking, but necessary, because somewhere in that evidence was the truth. As the days passed, detectives continued building their case. They examined Whiting's background more closely, and what they uncovered was deeply troubling. Years earlier, he had been convicted of abducting and sexually assaulting a young girl. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Same pattern, same target, same calculated approach. And yet he had been released. That fact alone began to echo through the investigation, like a warning that had gone unheeded. If someone like that could return to society without strict monitoring, then how many others were out there? The question lingered, heavy and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, investigators worked to place Whiting in the vicinity of Sarah's disappearance. Witness statements were revisited, timelines were tightened, every movement accounted for. Then came another critical development. A vehicle. Witnesses had previously mentioned a white van seen near the area around the time Sarah vanished. At first, it was just one of many leads, uncertain, unverified. But now, detectives began to re-examine that detail with fresh urgency. Because Roy Whiting owned a white van. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was a connection, a thread that tied him closer to the scene than before. And when investigators began to analyze forensic evidence linked to that vehicle, the case took a decisive turn. Inside laboratories, scientists worked with microscopic precision, comparing samples, isolating traces, building a profile of what had happened. Every result brought them one step closer to something solid, something undeniable. And then it happened. A match. Forensic evidence began linking Whiting directly to Sarah. Not speculation, not theory. Evidence. The kind that speaks without emotion, the kind that cannot lie. In that moment, the investigation shifted. This was no longer about narrowing down suspects. This was about building a case strong enough to secure justice. Detectives moved carefully now, aware that every step mattered. Surveillance intensified. Interviews became sharper, more focused. They weren't just looking for inconsistencies anymore, they were looking for confirmation. And slowly, piece by piece, the picture came together. A man with a history of targeting children. A man with access to a vehicle matching witness descriptions. A man now connected through forensic evidence to the victim. The weight of it was undeniable. But there was still one final step. They needed to bring him in. In the months that followed, investigators worked to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no doubt, no room for escape, no gaps in the evidence. This wasn't just about arresting a suspect. It was about securing a conviction. Because anything less would mean failure. And failure was not an option. Finally, the operation moved forward. Roy Whiting was arrested. For many, it was a moment of relief, but not closure, because while a suspect was now in custody, the full truth of what had happened still needed to be revealed. The investigation had uncovered enough to act, but the courtroom would demand everything. As news of the arrest broke, the nation reacted. Relief, anger, grief, all of it intertwined. Because this case had never been just about one child. It had become something larger, a reflection of fear, of vulnerability, of a system that many believed had failed to prevent what happened. And now, all eyes turned to what would come next. The trial. It would be the moment where evidence would be laid bare, where every detail would be examined, challenged, and scrutinized. A moment where the story of what happened to Sarah would finally be told, not through speculation but through facts. But even before the trial began, one truth had already settled into the minds of investigators. This case was different, not just because of the crime itself, but because of what it exposed. Failures, warnings that had been missed, a past that had not been taken seriously enough, and a tragedy that might have been prevented. As prosecutors prepared their case, they knew they weren't just presenting evidence against a man. They were presenting a story of how a child vanished in seconds, and how those seconds led to a chain of events that would change the United Kingdom forever. Because when the courtroom doors finally opened, the world would hear everything. The evidence, the timeline, the truth. And at the center of it all, the quiet, haunting presence of a girl whose life had been taken far too soon. The courtroom was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if even the air understood the weight of what was about to unfold. By the time the trial began, the case of Sarah Evelyn Isabel Payne had already left a permanent mark on the nation. Her name was no longer just known, it was remembered, carried in conversations, in headlines, in the quiet fears of parents who no longer saw the world the same way. Now all of that grief, all of that attention was focused on one place. The courtroom. And at the center of it sat the man accused of taking everything away. Roy Whiting. He appeared calm, controlled, almost detached, but around him the atmosphere told a different story, one of tension, of expectation, of a demand for answers that had been building for over a year. The prosecution began carefully. They didn't rush. Because this wasn't just about presenting evidence, it was about reconstructing a crime that had no direct witnesses. Every detail had to be precise. Every connection had to be clear. They started with the timeline. July 1st, 2000. A summer evening. A child playing near her grandparents' home. A brief moment of separation, and then disappearance. From there, they walked the jury through the search. The scale of it, the urgency, the growing realization that this was no ordinary missing persons case. They described the discovery of Sarah's body, the location, the condition of the scene. The courtroom listened. No movement. No sound. Because everyone knew what those details meant, even when they weren't spoken directly. Then came the forensic evidence. This was the backbone of the case, the part that would either hold everything together or let it fall apart. Experts took the stand one by one, explaining findings that, to the average person, might seem small, almost insignificant. Fibers, DNA traces, minute details collected from both the crime scene and items linked to Whiting. But when those details were placed side by side, they formed something powerful. A connection, a direct link between the victim and the accused. The prosecution made it clear this was not coincidence, this was not circumstantial. This was science. And science, unlike memory or testimony, does not forget, and it does not lie. As the evidence was presented, the weight of it became harder to ignore. Jurors leaned forward. Notes were taken more frequently. The silence in the room grew heavier, not empty, but full of understanding. Because piece by piece, the picture was becoming clearer. And it was pointing in one direction, toward the man sitting quietly at the center of it all. But the defense was ready. They challenged the evidence, questioned the methods, suggested alternative explanations, because in a case like this, even the smallest doubt could change everything. They argued that forensic evidence, while powerful, was not infallible, that interpretations could be flawed, that conclusions could be influenced. It was a battle, not of emotion but of precision. Every claim met with a counter. Every detail examined from every possible angle. And through it all, one truth remained constant. There were no eyewitnesses. No one had seen the exact moment Sarah was taken, which meant the entire case rested on what could be proven, not what could be imagined. Days turned into weeks. The trial continued, methodical and relentless. Witnesses spoke about sightings, about vehicles, about moments that seemed insignificant at the time but now carried weight. Investigators described the process, how leads were followed, how suspects were narrowed down, how the focus ultimately settled on Roy Whiting. And then came the part that would leave a lasting impact, not just on the jury, but on the country as a whole. Whiting's past. The prosecution revealed his prior conviction for abducting and sexually assaulting a young girl years earlier. The courtroom shifted. You could feel it, an almost physical change in the atmosphere. Because this wasn't just history. It was a pattern. A warning that had existed long before July 2000. And yet, it hadn't been enough to stop what happened next. That revelation didn't just strengthen the case, it raised questions. Questions about how someone with that history had been allowed back into society without closer monitoring. Questions that would later echo far beyond the courtroom. But for now, the focus remained on the present. On the evidence. On the decision that the jury would soon have to make. As closing arguments approached, both sides delivered their final narratives. The prosecution spoke of certainty, of evidence that formed a complete and unbroken chain, of a man whose actions had taken the life of a child and shattered a family. The defense spoke of doubt, of the importance of not rushing to judgment, of the principle that guilt must be proven beyond all reasonable doubt. Two perspectives. One decision. And then it was over. The jury withdrew. Time slowed. Outside the courtroom, the world waited. News outlets stood ready. Families held their breath. Because after everything, the search, the investigation, the trial, this was the moment that would define how the story ended. Hours passed. Then days. Each moment stretching the tension further. Until finally, the jury returned. The courtroom filled once more, every seat occupied, every eye fixed on the front. The verdict was read. Guilty. A single word, but one that carried the weight of everything that had come before it. Roy Whiting had been found guilty of abduction and murder. There was no outburst. No dramatic reaction. Just a quiet, collective release, as if the room itself had been holding its breath for months and could finally exhale. For Sarah's family, it was not closure, because nothing could bring her back. But it was justice. And sometimes, justice is the only answer left. Whiting was sentenced to life imprisonment, a punishment that ensured he would never again walk freely, never again have the opportunity to harm another child. But even as the case came to an end, its impact was only beginning. Because what happened to Sarah Payne didn't just change one family. It changed a nation. It forced conversations that had long been avoided. About safety, about responsibility, about how many warnings it takes before action is taken. In the months and years that followed, her name became more than a memory. It became a movement, a call for change, a demand that what happened in that quiet field in West Sussex would never be allowed to happen again. But the question remained, one that would linger long after the courtroom emptied. If the signs had been taken seriously, if the system had acted differently, would Sarah Payne still be alive today? That question, is what makes this story impossible to forget.